In the ruins of Tertius Majoris, 17 billion souls waited to discover their worth in the eyes of angels. When salvation arrived in the form of space marines, they brought with them calculations that would determine who among the masses deserved to live and who would die for the mathematics of war. The city had been beautiful once, before the war came, before the skies turned the color of dried blood and the air tasted of metal and ash. Before the chittering masses of the Tyrannid advance fleet began their inexorable march across continents, devouring everything in their path like a living tide of teeth and hunger. The planetary governor had sent 17 separate astropathic pleas for aid, each one more desperate than the last, each one carrying the weight of worlds in its electromagnetic scream across the void. The response, when it finally came, arrived in the form of 3 Thunderhawk gunships bearing the crimson and bone heraldry of the angels sanguinary. 17 billion people pressed against their windows, crowded onto rooftops, filled the streets in numbers that defied comprehension, all watching as the aircraft descended through the smoke-choked atmosphere like falling stars. Children pointed and laughed, thinking salvation had come. Their parents wept with relief, knowing that the Emperor's angels of death would surely deliver them from the Xenos nightmare approaching their walls. They were right, of course, about the salvation. They simply had no understanding of its true cost. Captain Dante Vex of the Angels' Sanguinary Third Company stood on the highest spire of the planetary governor's palace, his enhanced eyes surveying the sprawling metropolis below. Through his autosenses, he could process information at rates that would burn out mortal minds in seconds. Population density calculations flowed across his retinal display like falling rain. Resource allocation algorithms chimed softly in his ear. Tactical overlays painted the city in shades of strategic value, marking industrial sectors, transportation hubs, military installations, and civilian population centers with cold mathematical precision. The captain's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of the approaching horde long before any mortal ear could detect it, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, like the heartbeat of some vast and terrible god. The vibration traveled up through the foundations of the city, through the rockcrete and plasteel, into the bones of every living soul within its borders. Those with the keenest senses felt it first as an unease, a restlessness, a subtle wrongness that made them check their door locks twice and hold their children a little closer. Captain Vex knew exactly what that sound meant. He had heard it before, on Mordax Prime, on Helios the Seventh, on dozens of other worlds where the Great Devourer had come calling with its endless appetite. The sound was the collective movement of trillions of organisms, each one a living weapon honed by eons of evolution and warfare, all unified in their singular purpose of consumption. The Tyrannids were perhaps 8 hours away from the city's outer perimeter, maybe less. The captain activated his Vox link, and his voice carried across the tactical network with the weight of absolute authority. Begin the assessment protocol. All squads report readiness for immediate implementation of contingency measures. Far below, in the crowded streets and tenement blocks, the citizens of Tertius Majoris continued their desperate preparations. They had been at it for weeks now, ever since the first refugees began streaming in from the outlying settlements with tales of horror that defied belief. Barricades constructed from furniture and scrap metal blocked major thoroughfares. Civilian defense forces, hastily assembled from PDF remnants and volunteer militias, manned checkpoints with lasguns that most of them barely knew how to use. Food distribution centers operated around the clock, trying to stretch dwindling supplies among an ever-growing population of displaced persons. In the refugee camps that had sprung up in the city's parks and squares, families huddled together around fires built from broken debris, sharing stories and prayers and whatever meager rations they could obtain. Children played games of war in the shadows between tents, mimicking the movements they had seen from real soldiers, unaware that their innocent play was preparing them for a reality far more terrible than any game could capture. The elderly sat in circles, their weathered faces marked by the kind of weariness that comes from having survived too many disasters, too many losses, too many moments when the world seemed poised to end. None of them understood what was happening in the sealed chambers of the planetary governor's palace, where Captain Vex and his battle brothers had established their command center. None of them could have comprehended the calculations being performed, the variables being weighed, the cold equations that would determine their fates with mathematical precision. The assessment protocol had been developed over centuries of warfare, refined through bitter experience and countless tactical simulations. It was a systematic method for determining the optimal allocation of limited resources in the face of overwhelming odds, a way of maximizing the strategic value preserved when total preservation was impossible. The Space Marines called it many things in their private discussions: triage on a planetary scale, the Emperor's mathematics, the calculation of necessity. The civilians had simpler names for it, though they would not learn those names until it was far too late to matter. Brother Sergeant Maximus reviewed the data feeds streaming across his helmet display as his tactical squad established observation posts throughout the city's middle sectors. Through his enhanced vision, he could see the fear in every face, smell it in the sweat and pheromones that filled the recycled air. The mortals moved with the jerky, unpredictable patterns of prey animals sensing the approach of predators, their stress hormones painting bright chemical signatures that his enhanced olfactory systems could detect from hundreds of meters away. Population analysis subroutines compiled demographics in real time, sorting the 17 billion souls into categories that would have chilled their blood if they had understood the criteria being applied. Age, health status, skill sets, genetic markers, psychological profiles, likelihood of survival under extreme duress. Each person became a data point in a vast algorithmic matrix, their entire lives reduced to statistical probabilities and resource allocation coefficients. The sergeant's vox crackled with reports from observation teams scattered throughout the urban sprawl. Sector 7-7 showing optimal defensive positioning. Structural integrity at 82%. Population density within acceptable parameters. Industrial Zone 12. Maintaining full operational capacity. Workforce efficiency rating above baseline standards. Residential Block 49 shows signs of civil unrest. Recommend immediate intervention if preservation protocols are activated. Each report added another layer to the growing tactical picture, another piece of data in the vast puzzle that Captain Vex and his command staff were assembling. The city was being dissected, analyzed, catalogued with the same methodical precision that the Astartes applied to every aspect of warfare. Every street became a potential kill zone or defensive position. Every building was evaluated for its strategic worth, its structural integrity, its capacity to shelter valuable personnel or resources. Every person was assessed for their potential contribution to the war effort, their likelihood of survival, their place in the intricate hierarchy of necessity that governed all tactical decision-making. In the palace's deepest sub-levels, Tech Marine Kareth interfaced directly with the city's central cogitation systems, his mechanical appendages plugging into data ports with the smooth efficiency of long practice. His enhanced consciousness merged with the machine spirits of the urban infrastructure, allowing him to access information that no mortal administrator could have compiled in a dozen lifetimes. Power grid schematics flowed through his awareness like rivers of light. Water distribution networks mapped themselves in three-dimensional holographic displays. Transportation systems, communication arrays, manufacturing facilities, all of it became part of his expanded perception. The Tech Marine's augmented vocal cords produced the distinctive binary cant as he communed with the machine spirits, requesting status reports and system diagnostics with the reverence due to such ancient and noble artificial intelligences. The city's cogitators responded with streams of data that would have overwhelmed any merely human consciousness, but which Koreth processed with the casual ease of breathing. Population registers, resource inventories, production schedules, maintenance logs, criminal records, medical databases, educational transcripts, military service histories, genetic screening results, psychological evaluation profiles. Every citizen of Tertius Majoris existed within these data streams, their lives catalogued in exhaustive detail by the surveillance apparatus that was the inevitable companion of civilized existence in the Imperium. The Tech Marine could access birth certificates and death records, tax assessments and loyalty ratings, medical treatments and disciplinary actions, career achievements and social connections. He could trace bloodlines back generations, analyze genetic predispositions for disease and psychological instability, calculate productivity metrics and resource consumption patterns. All of this information flowed back to Captain Vex, who stood motionless in the palace's highest chamber, his superhuman mind processing tactical data with the cold efficiency of a purpose-built war machine. The approaching Tyranid horde was less than 6 hours away now, close enough that his enhanced hearing could distinguish individual creature types within the collective chittering. Gaunts by the millions, their claws scratching against rockcrete as they scrambled over obstacles in their path, the heavier tread of warriors, their bioweapons already priming for combat. The distinctive sound of Carnifex bio-titans, each footfall causing minor seismic tremors that registered on the palace's security sensors. The captain's battle brothers awaited his orders with the patient discipline that was their birthright. They had seen him perform similar calculations on other worlds, witnessed the terrible mathematics of survival played out in blood and fire. They trusted his judgment implicitly, knowing that whatever decision he reached would be based on centuries of tactical experience and the cold logic of military necessity. But trust and understanding were different things entirely. Even among the Astartes, there were some who struggled with the implications of the assessment protocol, some who found their enhanced intellects rebelling against the stark utilitarian calculus that reduced human lives to statistical variables. These Space Marines learned to suppress such doubts, to discipline their thoughts as rigorously as they disciplined their bodies, to accept that the greater good sometimes demanded sacrifices that no individual conscience could easily bear. Captain Vex felt no such internal conflict. His indoctrination had been complete, his conditioning absolute. He understood with perfect clarity that sentiment was the enemy of efficiency, that emotional attachments could compromise the clear thinking necessary for optimal tactical decisions. The 17 billion souls below were not people to him, not in any sense that would have been recognizable to their own understanding. They were resources, variables in a complex equation, assets to be preserved or expended according to strategic necessity. The first phase of the assessment protocol involved determining the city's maximum defensible population. This was not simply a matter of calculating how many people could physically fit within the urban perimeter, but rather how many could be sustained, protected, and effectively utilized under siege conditions. Food and water reserves, medical supplies, ammunition stocks, fuel reserves, all of these factors had to be balanced against the projected duration of the conflict and the expected casualty rates among both civilian and military personnel. Tech Marine Koreth's analysis indicated that the city's resources could sustain approximately 4 billion people for the estimated 6-month duration of the siege, assuming standard rationing protocols and acceptable mortality rates from disease and malnutrition. This figure assumed optimal distribution efficiency, complete civilian cooperation with military directives, and no significant disruption to the existing infrastructure during the course of the conflict. The mathematical reality was stark and unforgiving. 17 billion souls currently sheltered within the city's borders. 4 billion could potentially be sustained through the siege. The difference was 13 billion people whose continued existence represented a drain on resources that could otherwise be used to preserve those deemed more strategically valuable. Captain Vex reviewed the analysis with the same detached professionalism he would have applied to ammunition, inventory reports, or equipment maintenance schedules. The numbers were simply facts, data points to be incorporated into his tactical planning. The human cost, the individual tragedies, the families torn apart and dreams destroyed, these were abstractions that existed outside the scope of his calculations. They were emotional considerations, and emotion had no place in the pure logic of warfare. The second phase involved identifying preservation priorities. Not all civilians were equal in their strategic value, a reality that the Imperium had always acknowledged in its hierarchical social structure. The assessment protocol codified these distinctions into a formal ranking system that could be applied consistently across different combat scenarios and population groups. At the highest priority level were individuals whose skills and knowledge were deemed irreplaceable or critically important to the war effort. Tech priests and senior engineers who understood the maintenance requirements for vital infrastructure systems. Experienced military officers and non-commissioned personnel who could provide leadership for civilian defense forces. Medical professionals capable of treating both common ailments and exotic combat injuries. Skilled manufactorium workers who could adapt production lines to support the military campaign. These individuals would receive maximum protection and resource allocation, their survival prioritized above all other considerations. They would be relocated to the most secure facilities within the city, provided with the best available equipment and supplies, and assigned personal protection details if necessary. Their families would also receive elevated status, both as a psychological incentive for continued cooperation and as a practical matter of maintaining morale among critical personnel. The next tier consisted of individuals whose skills were valuable but not irreplaceable, administrative personnel who could manage complex logistics operations, educators who could maintain basic training programs for civilian auxiliaries, communication specialists who could operate and maintain Vox equipment under combat conditions, skilled laborers whose expertise could be adapted to military manufacturing requirements. These people would receive standard protection and resource allocation, their needs met to the extent that supplies allowed without compromising the security of higher priority individuals. They would be housed in designated sectors with adequate defenses, provided with basic equipment and training for self-defense, and given specific roles in the overall defensive plan. Below them came the general population, sorted into subcategories based on age, health, and potential military utility. Young adults in good physical condition could be conscripted into auxiliary forces or assigned to manual labor details. Older citizens with specialized knowledge could serve in advisory or training roles. Children represented potential future assets, but also immediate resource drains that had to be weighed against more immediate military necessities. At the bottom of the hierarchy were those deemed to have minimal strategic value. The elderly and infirm who could not contribute meaningfully to the war effort. Individuals with criminal records or questionable loyalty ratings. Those whose psychological profiles indicated poor performance under stress or likelihood of panic-induced disruptive behavior. The assessment protocol was clear about the fate of this final category. In situations where resources were insufficient to sustain the entire population, these individuals would be classified as expendable. Their rations would be redirected to higher priority groups. Their living spaces would be reallocated to more valuable personnel. They would be excluded from evacuation procedures if retreat became necessary. In practical terms, they would be left to die. Brother Sergeant Maximus watched the preparations with the detached interest of a professional evaluating a complex operational scenario. His tactical squad had been assigned to oversee the implementation of preservation protocols in the city's middle sectors, where the bulk of the skilled worker population resided. The mortals moved with increasing desperation as rumors spread through the crowded streets, though none of them truly understood what was happening. The first sign came when administrative personnel began conducting new population surveys, going door to door with data slates and conducting detailed interviews about occupations, skills, family connections, and health status. The questions seemed reasonable enough at first, the kind of thing that might be expected during a military emergency when resources needed to be allocated efficiently and personnel assignments made based on capability. But as the hours passed, patterns began to emerge that filled perceptive observers with a cold and growing dread. Certain individuals received small metal tokens that granted them access to special distribution centers where higher quality rations were available. Others found themselves assigned to specific residential blocks that happened to be located near the most heavily fortified sections of the city's defensive perimeter. Families were split up as some members received different priority classifications than others. Children separated from parents based on age and health assessments that no one would explain. The civilian population's initial gratitude toward their Space Marine protectors began to curdle into something approaching fear as they realized that salvation had come with conditions they had never been asked to accept. Whispered conversations in darkened alleyways spoke of neighbors who had been quietly relocated during the night, of entire residential blocks that had been declared off-limits to all but essential personnel, of distribution centers that had stopped serving anyone without proper authorization tokens. Those with the most valuable skills found themselves living in relative comfort, their families protected and their needs met with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. But for every person whose status improved, there seemed to be dozens whose circumstances grew steadily worse as resources were redistributed according to priorities they could not understand and had no power to influence. Captain Vex monitored these developments through the reports of his subordinates, noting with professional satisfaction that the implementation was proceeding according to established protocols. There had been some minor incidents of civil unrest, quickly suppressed by the presence of armed Space Marines, but nothing that threatened the overall stability of the operation. The civilian population was adapting to their new circumstances with the resigned pragmatism that centuries of Imperial rule had bred into the species. The Tyranid advance scouts were now less than 4 hours from the city's outer perimeter. Through long-range Auspex scans, the Space Marines could observe the leading edge of the Horde as it flowed across the landscape like a living flood, consuming everything in its path with methodical thoroughness. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a demonstration of evolutionary perfection turned toward the singular purpose of consumption and growth. Individual creatures were impossible to distinguish within the mass, but thermal imaging revealed the general composition of the approaching force. Countless termagants and hormagaunts formed the primary assault wave, their numbers so vast that they appeared as a single undulating carpet of movement across the planetary surface. Behind them came the heavier bioforms, Tyranid warriors and carnifexes whose role would be to exploit breaches in the defensive lines and provide synapse control for the smaller organisms. The sky above the Horde writhed with flying creatures, gargoyles and harpies that would provide aerial reconnaissance and targeted strikes against critical defensive positions. In the distance, barely visible even to enhanced Astartes optics, the massive silhouettes of bio-titans dominated the horizon like walking mountains of living weaponry. It was an enemy force that could have conquered entire star systems, a concentration of biomass and military capability that represented the accumulated consumption of dozens of worlds. Against such overwhelming odds, the survival of even a fraction of Tertius Majoris's population would constitute a strategic victory of significant magnitude. Captain Vex began the final phase of the assessment protocol, the actual implementation of preservation measures. Throughout the city, carefully prepared announcements began broadcasting over the public address systems, their tone calm and authoritative, as they outlined new emergency procedures that all citizens were required to follow for their own safety and the security of the defensive effort. Certain residential areas were being temporarily evacuated to allow for the construction of additional defensive positions. The residents would be relocated to more secure facilities in other parts of the city, though the announcements were vague about exactly where these facilities were located or when the relocated individuals might expect to return to their homes. Food and water distribution was being centralized to ensure more efficient allocation of resources during the siege. Citizens would need to report to designated centers at specific times, bringing proper identification and authorization tokens to receive their assigned rations. Those without proper documentation would need to report to processing centers where their status could be verified and appropriate arrangements made. All civilians with critical skills were required to report immediately to mobilization centers where they would receive specialized training and equipment for their roles in the defensive effort. Their families would be provided with appropriate accommodations and protection while they fulfilled their duties to the Emperor and the Imperium. The language was bureaucratic and reassuring, designed to promote compliance rather than panic. But beneath the careful phrasing lay the steel framework of the assessment protocol, the systematic sorting of human lives into categories of value and expendability. Those who read between the lines, who understood the implications of terms like temporary evacuation and appropriate arrangements, began to make their own desperate preparations. Some tried to flee the city entirely, loading whatever possessions they could carry into ground vehicles and attempting to escape through the outer perimeter before the Tyranids arrived. These attempts were quietly intercepted by Space Marine patrols. The would-be refugees turned back with explanations about the dangers of traveling through areas that might already be compromised by Xenos infiltrators. The real reason was simpler. The assessment protocol required accurate population counts and resource allocation calculations, objectives that would be compromised if significant numbers of people were allowed to leave the designated area. Others attempted to improve their priority status through various forms of deception or bribery, claiming skills they did not possess or attempting to purchase higher-tier authorization tokens from corrupt officials. These efforts were largely futile, as the Space Marines' assessment methods were far more sophisticated than the desperate civilians realized. Biometric scans, genetic analysis, and psychological evaluation could reveal the truth about any individual within minutes, making it impossible to sustain false claims about capability or value. A few recognized the true nature of what was happening and tried to organize resistance movements, gathering groups of like-minded individuals who were unwilling to accept their assigned fate in the preservation hierarchy. These efforts were detected and neutralized with the same clinical efficiency that the Astartes applied to all forms of tactical problem-solving. The organizers simply disappeared during the night, their followers scattered and demoralized by the demonstration of their protector's absolute authority. Brother Sergeant Maximus led one such intervention personally, his tactical squad moving through the darkened streets with the silent precision of apex predators stalking their prey. The target was a former PDF colonel who had been attempting to rally civilian resistance in the industrial sectors, spreading dangerous ideas about the Space Marines' true intentions and encouraging others to defy the preservation protocols. The operation was completed within minutes. The target extracted from his hiding place and transported to a secure facility for interrogation and processing. His followers were left with clear evidence of their powerlessness in the face of Astartes' capabilities, a message that would spread quickly through the civilian population and discourage similar attempts at organized resistance. The sergeant felt no particular emotion about the operation, neither satisfaction nor regret. It was simply a tactical necessity, a problem that required solution in order to maintain the overall effectiveness of the preservation effort. The colonel had possessed potentially valuable military experience, but his refusal to accept proper authority made him more dangerous than useful. His removal would actually improve the long-term stability of the civilian population by eliminating a source of disruptive influence. As the final hours before the Tyranid assault ticked away, the true scope of the assessment protocol began to become clear. Throughout the city, millions of people found themselves subtly but inexorably herded into specific areas, their movement controlled by a combination of incentives, restrictions, and direct intervention. Those with high priority ratings were gathered in the most defensible sections of the urban core, surrounded by the heaviest fortifications and the largest concentrations of Space Marine personnel. Lower priority individuals found themselves assigned to outer sectors, areas that would serve as buffer zones during the initial assault phases. They were provided with basic weapons and minimal training, told that their role was to delay and disrupt the Xenos' advance while the main defensive positions prepared for siege warfare. The reality, which none of them fully understood, was that they were being positioned to absorb the first wave of Tyranid attacks, their sacrifice buying time for the preservation of more valuable assets. The lowest priority groups were directed to facilities that had been designated as temporary shelters, massive structures in the city's outermost districts that could house hundreds of thousands of people in cramped but theoretically safe conditions. These shelters were equipped with basic life support systems and minimal supplies, enough to sustain their occupants for perhaps a few days under optimal conditions. What the shelters lacked were adequate defensive measures, communication systems, or any means of evacuation if the Tyranid assault proved successful in those sectors. They were, in essence, containment facilities designed to concentrate expendable population groups in areas where their loss would not compromise the overall defensive effort. Captain Vex reviewed the final deployment statistics with professional satisfaction. The preservation protocols had been implemented with exceptional efficiency. The 17 billion souls of Tertius Majoris sorted and positioned according to their strategic value, with minimal disruption to overall defensive preparations. Resource allocation had been optimized, defensive positions had been manned by the most capable available personnel, and potential sources of civilian unrest had been neutralized or contained. The mathematics of survival had been calculated with precision, the variables weighted and balanced to maximize the probability of preserving the most strategically valuable elements of the population. It was a masterpiece of military planning, a demonstration of the cold logic that allowed the Imperium to survive in a galaxy filled with existential threats. The human cost was immense, of course. 13 billion people had been effectively condemned to death, their fates sealed by algorithms that reduced their entire lives to statistical probabilities and resource allocation coefficients. Families had been torn apart, communities destroyed, dreams and hopes and individual human dignity sacrificed on the altar of tactical necessity. But these were considerations that existed outside the scope of military planning. The Space Marines were not social workers or humanitarian aid coordinators. They were weapons of war, designed and trained for the singular purpose of achieving victory against the enemies of mankind. If that victory required difficult choices and painful sacrifices, then those choices would be made without hesitation or regret. The first Tyranid organisms reached the city's outer perimeter just as the final phase of civilian deployment was completing. Scout creatures, small and swift, probed the defensive positions with the patient intelligence of predators testing their prey's strength and resolve. They were met by concentrated lasgun fire from the outer defense lines, manned by civilians who had been classified as expendable but who fought with the desperate courage of those who understood that retreat was not an option. Behind these scout forces, the main assault was massing, a tide of living weapons that would test every aspect of the preservation protocols in the crucible of actual combat. The assessment had been completed, the calculations made, the fates of billions determined by the cold mathematics of warfare. Now they would discover whether the Angels Sanguinary had chosen correctly, whether their brutal efficiency in sorting the worthy from the expendable would prove sufficient to preserve something valuable from the coming storm of teeth and claws and endless ravenous hunger. In the depths of the most secure bunker, surrounded by the highest priority civilians and the most sophisticated defensive systems the Imperium could provide, Captain Vex monitored the tactical displays with the patient attention of a master craftsman observing his work. The battle for Tertius Majoris was about to begin, and every death, every sacrifice, every moment of heroism or cowardice would serve as data points in future calculations. The assessment protocol would be refined, based on the results, its algorithms updated and improved for the next world, the next impossible choice, the next time that Space Marines would be forced to decide who among the masses of humanity deserved the chance to survive another day. Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there was never enough salvation to go around. And someone, somewhere, would always have to make the calculations that determined who lived and who died in the Emperor's name. The sound of gunfire echoed across the city as the outer defense lines engaged the first wave of Tyranid assault troops. In the distance, the distinctive roar of bolter weapons mixed with the inhuman screaming of dying Xenos, creating a symphony of violence that would continue for days or weeks until one side or the other achieved total victory. 17 billion souls had waited to discover their worth in the eyes of angels. Now, as the battle began in earnest, They would learn whether the Space Marines' calculations had been sufficient to preserve what could be preserved from the Great Devourer's endless appetite. The assessment was complete. The trial by fire had begun. Brother Sergeant Maximus stood atop a reinforced observation post in Sector 12, watching through his helmet's enhanced optics as the first wave of Hormagaunts crashed against the outer defensive perimeter like a tide of living razors. The civilian defenders manning those positions had been given lasguns and basic tactical training, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the reality of facing the Great Devourer's children in open combat. Through his Vox link, he could hear their panicked voices as they called for support, ammunition, medical assistance, anything that might help them hold their assigned positions for a few more minutes. Some of the requests were denied based on resource allocation priorities. Others were fulfilled with the minimum necessary supplies, enough to keep the defensive line functional without compromising more strategically important operations elsewhere in the city. The sergeant's enhanced hearing could distinguish individual voices within the chaos, could identify specific civilians by their vocal patterns and emotional signatures. There was Marcus Venn, a mid-level administrative clerk whose request for additional power cells had been approved because his position controlled a choke point that would be expensive to retake if it fell. There was Sarah Chen, a medical technician whose desperate plea for evacuation assistance had been categorized as low priority because her sector was classified as expendable territory. Each voice represented a human life, a unique individual with personal history, relationships, fears, and dreams. The sergeant's enhanced memory could access their complete assessment profiles, could recall every detail of their background data, their skill evaluations, their priority classifications. He knew that Marcus had 2 children in the high-security residential zone, that Sarah had volunteered for frontline medical duty despite her relatively low combat rating, that both of them would likely be dead within the next few hours as the Tyranid advance overwhelmed their positions. This knowledge affected him no more than weather reports or equipment maintenance schedules. His conditioning had been designed to suppress exactly these kinds of emotional responses to maintain the psychological clarity necessary for optimal tactical decision-making. Individual casualties were inevitable in any military operation, acceptable losses that had been calculated and accounted for in the overall strategic framework. The outer perimeter held for 37 minutes before the first major breakthrough occurred in Sector 9. A pack of Raveners had tunneled beneath the defensive positions, emerging behind the civilian gun emplacements and slaughtering the defenders before they could respond to the threat. The breach allowed several hundred Hormagaunts to penetrate the outer zone, beginning the systematic consumption of infrastructure and personnel that would gradually weaken the city's overall defensive capability. Captain Vex observed these developments through the tactical network, noting the timing and location of each breakthrough with the same attention he might have devoted to studying a particularly complex equipment manual. The outer perimeter had been expected to fall within the first hour of sustained assault. The fact that it had held for 37 minutes represented a performance slightly above projected parameters, suggesting that the civilian defenders were fighting with greater determination than statistical models had predicted. This information would be valuable for future assessment calculations. Apparently, the proximity of imminent death could motivate even low-priority individuals to exceed their expected performance levels. The knowledge would be incorporated into revised algorithms, allowing for more accurate predictions of defensive capability during similar operations. The captain's attention was drawn to a series of urgent reports coming in from the outer residential zones, areas where the lowest priority civilians had been concentrated in temporary shelter facilities. The massive structures had been designed to house hundreds of thousands of people in conditions that met minimum sustainability requirements while keeping them safely out of the way of more important defensive operations. Unfortunately, the Tyranids had identified these facilities as particularly rich feeding opportunities. The bioships in orbit had been conducting detailed biological scans of the city since their arrival, mapping concentrations of organic matter with the same thoroughness that human military forces mapped strategic resources. The shelter facilities showed up on their sensors like beacons, massive accumulations of biomass conveniently gathered in defensible positions. 3 separate Trigon biotitans had emerged from underground tunnel networks directly beneath the largest shelter complex, their massive forms erupting through the floor with devastating effect. The facility's minimal defensive systems were overwhelmed in seconds, leaving hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped in a structure that had become their tomb. Their screams filled the emergency communication channels, desperate pleas for evacuation assistance that could not be answered because no resources had been allocated for such contingencies. Captain Vex listened to these reports with the same professional detachment he applied to all battlefield intelligence. The loss of the shelter complex had been anticipated as a likely outcome, factored into the overall casualty projections for the first phase of the siege. The civilians contained within it had been classified as expendable from the beginning, their deaths serving the strategic purpose of diverting Tyranid resources away from more valuable targets. The fact that their final moments were filled with terror and betrayal was regrettable but irrelevant. Wars were not won by sentiment or humanitarian considerations. They were won by making the hard choices that preserved what could be preserved while sacrificing what must be sacrificed for the greater good. In the high-priority residential sectors, the situation was markedly different. These areas had been reinforced with the best defensive systems available, manned by carefully selected personnel with proven combat experience, and equipped with sufficient supplies to withstand extended siege conditions. When Tyranid assault forces probed these positions, they met concentrated firepower from heavy weapon emplacements, coordinated counterattacks from Space Marine tactical squads, and defensive measures that had been designed specifically to counter Xenos bio-warfare tactics. The contrast was stark and intentional. Citizens with high assessment ratings found themselves in positions that were as secure as military engineering could make them, their safety prioritized above all other considerations. Their children attended emergency schools in reinforced bunkers, taught by educators who had been selected for their ability to maintain morale and educational standards under extreme stress. Their medical needs were met by the most experienced practitioners available, using equipment and supplies that had been reserved specifically for critical personnel. These fortunate few lived in conditions that, while austere by peacetime standards, represented luxury compared to the fate of those who had been deemed expendable. They ate regular meals prepared from high-quality rations. They slept in climate-controlled environments protected by multiple layers of defensive systems. They received regular updates about the progress of the battle, information that helped maintain their confidence in the ultimate success of the defensive effort. Most importantly, they were never told about the sacrifices being made on their behalf, never informed about the millions of their fellow citizens who were dying to buy time and resources for their preservation. The assessment protocol included strict information control measures designed to prevent exactly this kind of knowledge from reaching high-priority individuals. Morale among critical personnel was itself a strategic resource, one that could be compromised by unnecessary exposure to difficult truths. Brother Apothecary Sanguis moved through the high-priority medical facilities, monitoring the health and psychological condition of the preserved population with the same thoroughness he would have applied to maintaining the combat readiness of his battle brothers. His enhanced senses could detect stress hormones, nutritional deficiencies, and early signs of psychological breakdown with remarkable precision, allowing him to prescribe treatments and interventions before problems became serious enough to compromise individual effectiveness. The work was surprisingly complex, requiring not just medical expertise but also a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Many of the preserved civilians were experiencing guilt about their elevated status, worry about friends and family members who had been assigned to lower priority categories, and general anxiety about the progress of the battle raging around them. These emotional responses had to be managed carefully to prevent them from developing into more serious psychological disorders that could affect overall productivity and morale. The apothecary employed a combination of pharmaceutical interventions, therapeutic counseling, and carefully controlled information distribution to maintain optimal psychological conditions among the preserved population. Anti-anxiety medications were administered to individuals showing signs of acute stress. Group therapy sessions allowed people to process their experiences in structured environments where trained facilitators could guide conversations away from potentially disruptive topics. Regular briefings provided carefully selected information about military progress, emphasizing positive developments while downplaying setbacks or casualties. It was a comprehensive system for maintaining human resources in peak condition, as sophisticated as any equipment maintenance protocol and considerably more challenging to implement. The apothecary took professional pride in his ability to keep the preserved population functioning at optimal levels despite the extraordinary stress of their circumstances. Outside the protected zones, the battle for Tertius Majoris continued with escalating intensity. The Tyranid assault had evolved beyond simple frontal attacks to include sophisticated tactical maneuvers that demonstrated the hive mind's growing understanding of human defensive strategies. Bioship-coordinated orbital strikes targeted specific infrastructure nodes, seeking to disrupt power distribution, communication networks, and transportation systems that supported the city's defensive capabilities. Flying creatures conducting aerial reconnaissance identified weak points in the defensive perimeter, relaying this information back to ground forces through the synaptic network that linked all Tyranid organisms into a single coordinated intelligence. Within hours, concentrated attacks began targeting these vulnerable positions with surgical precision, demonstrating the hive mind's ability to adapt and learn from battlefield conditions. The middle-tier civilian populations, those deemed valuable enough to preserve but not critical enough to receive maximum protection, found themselves bearing the brunt of this adaptive strategy. Their defensive positions occupied the crucial space between the expendable outer zones and the heavily fortified inner core, making them the primary targets for Tyranid forces seeking to penetrate deeper into the city's defensive structure. These civilians fought with desperate courage, knowing that retreat would mean abandoning their assigned roles in the preservation hierarchy. They had been told that their sacrifice was necessary for the greater good, that their willingness to hold contested ground would allow more valuable assets to be protected from the Xenos' advance. What they had not been told was that their positions had been deliberately selected for their expendability, chosen specifically because they could be abandoned without compromising critical defensive objectives. Corporal Helena Voss of the Civilian Auxiliary Forces crouched behind a makeshift barricade in Sector 15, her lasgun growing hot from continuous firing as wave after wave of Hormagaunts crashed against her position. Her unit had been holding the same intersection for 6 hours, watching their numbers steadily dwindle as ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. She had requested reinforcements 4 times through the Vox network, each request met with promises of support that never materialized. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see the distinctive silhouettes of Space Marines operating in adjacent sectors, their massive forms moving with lethal precision as they eliminated Xenos threats with terrifying efficiency. But none of them moved to support her position, despite the obvious tactical value of the intersection she was defending. She began to suspect that her unit had been forgotten, left to hold an unimportant position while more significant battles raged elsewhere. The truth was more disturbing than mere neglect. Corporal Voss and her unit had been classified as acceptable losses, their sacrifice calculated to provide tactical intelligence about Tyranid assault patterns while buying time for more valuable assets to consolidate their defenses. Their desperate fight was being monitored through surveillance networks, every detail of their engagement recorded and analyzed for future reference. When her position finally fell, overwhelmed by a coordinated assault from multiple Tyranid bioforms, the data collected from her unit's final stand would be incorporated into updated tactical databases. Her death and the deaths of her comrades would contribute to the refinement of the assessment protocol, helping to improve the accuracy of future calculations about civilian combat effectiveness and optimal resource allocation strategies. Brother Sergeant Maximus watched the fall of Sector 15 through his helmet's tactical display, noting the timing and tactical details with professional interest. The civilian defenders had performed slightly better than projected, holding their position for 6 hours and 14 minutes against sustained assault. This represented a variance of approximately 8% from statistical predictions, information that would be valuable for calibrating future defensive calculations. The sergeant's enhanced memory automatically catalogued the engagement details, storing them alongside thousands of other tactical observations that had been accumulated over centuries of warfare. Each battle contributed to his understanding of combat dynamics. Each sacrifice provided data points that improved his ability to make accurate assessments about military capability and resource allocation requirements. He felt no particular emotion about the civilians' deaths, neither satisfaction nor regret. They had fulfilled their assigned function in the overall defensive strategy, their sacrifice contributing to objectives that extended far beyond their individual fates. The assessment protocol had determined their optimal utilization, and they had performed within acceptable parameters until the inevitable conclusion of their assigned role. This was the nature of warfare at the scale required by the Imperium's survival. Individual lives, no matter how precious they might seem to those who lived them, were ultimately expendable resources in the greater calculus of species preservation. The Space Marines understood this truth with perfect clarity, their enhanced minds freed from the emotional attachments that clouded mortal judgment. As the siege entered its second day, the full scope of the assessment protocol's implementation became increasingly apparent to those civilians who possessed the intelligence and observational skills to recognize the patterns. The city's population was being systematically sorted and consumed according to predetermined priority rankings, with each group's fate determined by calculations that had been made long before the first tyrannid organisms reached the outer perimeter. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a senior research scientist who had been classified as high priority due to her expertise in xenobiology, began to understand the true nature of their situation as she worked in the secured laboratory facilities deep within the inner defensive zone. Her research assignment involved analyzing captured tyrannid biosamples to identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited by human forces, work that was deemed critical enough to justify significant resource allocation for her protection and support. But her scientific training had taught her to recognize patterns and draw conclusions from incomplete data, skills that proved disturbingly applicable to her current circumstances. She noticed that certain categories of personnel were conspicuously absent from the high security zones. She observed the systematic allocation of resources and supplies according to principles that seemed to have little relationship to immediate military necessity. She began to suspect that she and her colleagues were not just being protected, but were being preserved according to criteria that treated human lives as strategic assets, rather than individuals deserving of equal consideration. Her growing understanding filled her with a profound sense of complicity in something that violated every principle of human dignity and moral responsibility she had ever held. She was alive and safe because other people, equally deserving of protection, had been deemed expendable by calculations she had played no role in making. Her expertise in xenobiology made her valuable enough to preserve, while millions of others died simply because they lacked skills that the assessment protocol considered strategically important. The knowledge was almost unbearable, but she was trapped by circumstances that offered no meaningful alternatives. Speaking out would accomplish nothing except to jeopardize her own status and possibly compromise the defensive effort that was the only hope for anyone's survival. Refusing to cooperate would not save the expendable populations, but would certainly doom herself and potentially undermine research that could benefit the broader war effort. She continued her work with growing reluctance, each discovery about tyrannid biology feeling like a betrayal of those who had been sacrificed to make her survival possible. The moral weight of her position pressed down on her consciousness like a physical burden, a constant reminder of the ethical compromises that survival sometimes demanded. Captain Vex monitored these psychological developments through the surveillance systems that tracked all personnel in the high security zones. Dr. Hawthorne's emotional state was well within normal parameters for individuals experiencing moral stress related to their preservation status. Her productivity remained high despite her psychological distress, indicating that her work assignments could continue without immediate intervention. If her condition deteriorated to the point where it compromised her effectiveness, medical protocols existed for addressing such problems. Pharmaceutical interventions could modify brain chemistry to reduce emotional responses that interfered with optimal performance. Psychological reconditioning techniques could help individuals develop more appropriate perspectives on their roles and responsibilities. In extreme cases, memory modification procedures could eliminate problematic recollections and replace them with more suitable mental content. These measures were considered routine maintenance procedures, no different from servicing equipment or updating software. Human consciousness was simply another type of technology that occasionally required adjustment to maintain peak operational efficiency. The assessment protocol included detailed guidelines for managing such interventions, ensuring that critical personnel remained productive regardless of their personal reactions to the circumstances of their preservation. The captain's attention was drawn to a series of urgent tactical reports from the outer defensive sectors. The Tyranid assault had intensified significantly as more bioship resources were committed to the ground campaign. Massive Carnifex bio-titans were now engaging the middle-tier defensive positions directly, their living artillery systems pounding civilian defensive works with organic projectiles that could penetrate even reinforced rockcrete structures. Flying Tyranid forms had established air superiority over much of the city, their swarm attacks overwhelming the limited anti-aircraft defenses that protected civilian sectors. Without air cover, ground forces found themselves vulnerable to coordinated strikes that could appear from any direction with little or no warning. Most significantly, the hive mind appeared to have identified the pattern of the assessment protocol's implementation. Tyranid forces were increasingly focusing their attacks on high-value targets, seeking to eliminate the most strategically important assets rather than simply consuming biomass indiscriminately. This suggested a level of tactical sophistication that had not been anticipated in the original defensive calculations. The implications were disturbing. If the Tyranids could identify and target priority populations with precision, the entire foundation of the assessment protocol could be compromised. The sacrifice of expendable populations would become meaningless if the preserved assets they were intended to protect could be eliminated through targeted attacks. Captain Vex began implementing adaptive countermeasures, repositioning critical personnel to locations that would be more difficult for Xenos forces to identify and assault. Decoy facilities were established to confuse enemy reconnaissance efforts. Communication protocols were modified to prevent the Tyranids from identifying command structures through traffic analysis. Additional layers of defensive screening were deployed around the most important preservation zones. These measures represented a significant deviation from the original assessment calculations, requiring resource allocations that had not been initially planned. The captain authorized the redeployment by reclassifying certain middle-tier populations as expendable, freeing up the personnel and equipment needed to implement enhanced protection for critical assets. The decision was made without consultation or notification of the affected individuals, who would discover their changed status only when support and supplies stopped reaching their positions. Brother Codicarius Malpheus of the Angel's Sanguinary Librarium stood in the deepest meditation chambers of the planetary governor's palace. His psychic consciousness extended through the warp to monitor the approaching Tyranid hive fleet. Through his enhanced psyker abilities, he could perceive the shadow in the warp that accompanied all major Tyranid incursions, a nullification of psychic activity that created zones of absolute silence in the Imperium. But within that silence, subtle patterns could be detected by those with sufficient skill and training. The hive mind's approach to tactical decision-making left traces that could be interpreted by experienced battle psychers, psychic echoes that revealed something of the alien intelligence's priorities and strategic assessments. What the Codicarius perceived through his warp-touched senses filled him with growing unease about the likely effectiveness of their defensive strategy. The Tyranids were not simply seeking to consume the biomass of Tertius Majoris. They were actively studying human defensive patterns, learning to identify the logical structures that governed Imperial military thinking. The assessment protocol, with its systematic categorization and resource allocation patterns, was creating exactly the kind of predictable behavior that hive mind intelligence was optimized to exploit. Every decision made according to assessment guidelines generated data that the Tyranids could analyze and counter. Every movement of personnel, every allocation of resources, every tactical choice created patterns that alien intelligence could learn to predict and neutralize. The very systematic efficiency that made the protocol effective was also making it vulnerable to countermeasures from an enemy that could process and respond to tactical information at superhuman speeds. The Codicarius relayed his concerns through the psychic communication network that linked the Space Marine command structure, his mental sendings carrying the weight of urgent tactical intelligence. Captain Vex received the information with the same professional attention he devoted to all battlefield reports, but the implications were clear enough to trigger immediate reassessment of strategic priorities. If the assessment protocol was compromising their defensive effectiveness by creating predictable patterns, modifications would be necessary to maintain tactical viability. This presented complex challenges, as the systematic approaches that made the protocol efficient were precisely what allowed it to function at the scale required by planetary defense operations. Random elements would need to be introduced to disrupt Tyranid pattern analysis capabilities. Resource allocations would need to include deliberately inefficient choices that served no strategic purpose beyond confusing enemy intelligence assessments. Personnel movements would require inconsistencies that sacrificed optimal positioning in favor of tactical unpredictability. These changes would inevitably reduce the overall effectiveness of the preservation effort, increasing casualty rates among both expendable and critical populations. But the alternative was complete tactical transparency, allowing the hive mind to predict and counter every aspect of their defensive strategy with potentially catastrophic results. Captain Vex authorized the implementation of randomization protocols, accepting the reduced efficiency as a necessary cost for maintaining strategic viability. The mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly complex, requiring calculations that balanced multiple variables in ways that challenged even enhanced Astartes' cognitive capabilities. The first randomization measures were implemented during the third day of the siege, as Tyranid forces reached the middle-tier defensive positions and began their systematic assault on the city's secondary defensive perimeter. Without warning or explanation, certain high-priority individuals found themselves reassigned to lower security positions, while some previously expendable populations were relocated to better protected facilities. These changes violated the logical structure of the assessment protocol, creating apparent inconsistencies that confused both the affected civilians and the lower-ranking Space Marines responsible for implementation. Families that had been separated based on priority classifications found themselves unexpectedly reunited, while others discovered that their improved circumstances were suddenly reversed without explanation. The psychological impact of these changes was severe, undermining the sense of predictability and fairness that had allowed many civilians to accept their assigned roles in the preservation hierarchy. People began to suspect that their fates were being determined by arbitrary decisions rather than rational assessment criteria, leading to increased anxiety and decreased cooperation with military directives. But the tactical benefits were almost immediately apparent. Tyranid assault patterns, which had been showing increasing precision in targeting high-value positions, became less focused as the hive mind struggled to identify consistent patterns in human defensive arrangements. Attack effectiveness decreased as Xenos forces found themselves engaging targets that proved to be less strategically important than their analysis had predicted. The randomization introduced chaos into both sides of the conflict, reducing the overall efficiency of defensive operations while simultaneously degrading the effectiveness of Tyranid tactical responses. It was a deliberate embrace of confusion as a strategic asset, accepting reduced performance in favor of tactical unpredictability. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne experienced the effects of randomization personally when she was abruptly transferred from her secure laboratory facility to a research station located in one of the contested middle sectors. The official explanation involved resource allocation requirements and tactical necessities, but she understood that her reassignment represented a deliberate introduction of inefficiency into the preservation system. Her new position was far more dangerous, with minimal defensive protection and uncertain supply lines. The research facilities were inferior to those she had left behind, reducing her ability to contribute meaningfully to the xenobiology analysis that had justified her high-priority status. The reassignment seemed to contradict every principle of rational resource utilization that should have governed military decision-making. Yet as she began her work in the new location, she noticed that Tyranid attacks on research facilities had become less precise and effective than they had been during the first days of the siege. Previously, Xenos forces had demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify and target the most important scientific installations. Now their strikes seemed more random, suggesting that the human defensive strategy had successfully confused their pattern analysis capabilities. The randomization was working, even as it increased the personal danger faced by individuals like herself. Her reduced security and inferior working conditions were acceptable costs for maintaining the strategic unpredictability that prevented the Tyranids from optimizing their assault tactics. She was more likely to die in her new assignment, but her death would be less predictable to enemy forces, making it harder for them to concentrate their attacks on truly critical targets. The moral implications were staggering. The assessment protocol had sorted human lives according to strategic value, but now even that systematic approach was being deliberately corrupted by random elements designed to confuse alien intelligence. People were dying not because their lives were deemed worthless, but because their deaths were tactically useful in creating patterns that were harder for Xenos forces to analyze and counter. She continued her research with grim determination, knowing that her work remained important despite the increased dangers of her situation. The knowledge she generated about Tyranid biology could still contribute to defensive effectiveness, even if her survival had been made less certain by tactical considerations beyond her understanding or control. The siege entered its fourth day with casualty rates exceeding all original projections. The randomization protocols had successfully disrupted Tyranid tactical analysis, but at the cost of degrading human defensive efficiency to levels that threatened the overall viability of the preservation effort. Captain Vex found himself managing a complex balance between tactical unpredictability and strategic effectiveness, adjusting randomization parameters in real time as battlefield conditions evolved. The civilian population had begun to understand, in fragmentary and incomplete ways, that their fates were being determined by calculations they could neither influence nor fully comprehend. Rumors spread through the contested sectors, whispered conversations about the true nature of the assessment protocol and the reasons behind the seemingly arbitrary changes in individual assignments and resource allocations. Some civilians attempted to game the system, deliberately behaving in ways that they hoped would influence their priority classifications or improve their chances of favorable reassignment. Others retreated into fatalistic acceptance, recognizing their powerlessness to affect outcomes that were determined by factors beyond their knowledge or control. A few, those with the analytical skills to recognize the broader patterns, began to understand that they were participants in a vast tactical experiment, their lives serving as variables in calculations designed to optimize resistance against an alien intelligence that could learn and adapt to human decision-making patterns. This knowledge was both terrifying and strangely liberating, offering a framework for understanding their circumstances that transcended individual concerns about survival and preservation. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Angel's Sanguinary First Company arrived on Tertius Majoris during the fourth night of the siege, his strike cruiser translating from the warp directly into the contested orbital space above the planet. His mission was to assess the effectiveness of the assessment protocol implementation and determine whether the defensive strategy should be continued, modified, or abandoned in favor of alternative approaches. The captain's experience with similar operations on dozens of other worlds gave him a unique perspective on the tactical challenges facing the defenders of Tertius Majoris. He could evaluate both the mathematical elegance of the assessment calculations and the practical realities of implementing such systematic approaches under combat conditions against an adaptable enemy. His initial assessment was sobering. The protocol had succeeded in preserving approximately 4 billion civilians in relatively secure conditions, protecting critical personnel and strategic resources from the worst effects of the Tyranid assault. But the cost had been enormous, with casualty rates among middle and lower-tier populations exceeding sustainable levels. More critically, the need for randomization measures was undermining the systematic efficiency that made the protocol viable in the first place. Captain Thaddeus convened an emergency council of war, bringing together the senior commanders responsible for different aspects of the defensive effort. The discussions were conducted with the clinical precision that characterized all Space Marine tactical deliberations, but the underlying tensions were evident to those with sufficient experience to recognize them. Captain Vex defended his implementation of the assessment protocol, citing statistical evidence of its effectiveness in preserving critical assets under impossible odds. His calculations showed that the systematic approach had achieved preservation rates significantly higher than traditional defensive strategies would have managed against comparable Tyranid incursions. Brother Codicarius Malpheus presented psychic intelligence, indicating that the hive mind was continuing to adapt its tactical approaches, learning to counter even the randomization measures that had initially disrupted its pattern analysis capabilities. He warned that further modifications would be necessary to maintain defensive effectiveness, changes that would likely require even greater deviations from optimal resource allocation strategies. Techmarine Koreth provided infrastructure assessments showing that the city's defensive capacity was degrading faster than anticipated, with critical systems failing under the stress of sustained combat operations. His projections indicated that total defensive collapse would occur within 6 days unless significant changes were made to resource allocation priorities. The tactical picture was clear. The assessment protocol was simultaneously succeeding and failing, preserving valuable assets while consuming resources at unsustainable rates. The systematic approach that made it effective was also making it predictable to an enemy intelligence that could adapt faster than human tactical responses could evolve. Captain Thaddeus faced the kind of decision that defined the nature of Space Marine Command. Continue with a strategy that was working but becoming increasingly vulnerable, or abandon systematic approaches in favor of tactical methods that might be less efficient but more sustainable. The choice would affect the fates of billions of people, determining not just who would live or die, but how their deaths would be utilized in the broader calculus of Imperial survival. The Council reached its conclusion through the methodical analysis of available options, each alternative evaluated according to multiple criteria including tactical effectiveness, resource sustainability, strategic unpredictability, and long-term preservation outcomes. The decision was reached without sentiment or emotional consideration, based purely on mathematical assessment of probable results under various scenarios. The assessment protocol would be abandoned. In its place, they would implement an approach that prioritized tactical flexibility over systematic efficiency, accepting reduced preservation rates in exchange for strategic sustainability. The carefully calculated priority hierarchies would be dissolved, replaced by fluid resource allocation systems that could adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions without creating predictable patterns for enemy exploitation. The decision meant that the sacrifices made during the first 4 days of the siege had been largely meaningless. The expendable populations who had died to preserve more valuable assets had not, in fact, contributed to any sustainable defensive strategy. Their deaths had been tactical experiments, data points in calculations that were now being discarded as the Space Marines adapted to enemy countermeasures. Captain Vex received these orders with the same professional discipline he had shown throughout the crisis. The assessment protocol had been his responsibility to implement, and he had done so with exceptional efficiency under challenging circumstances. Its abandonment reflected changing tactical requirements rather than any failure in execution or judgment. The transition to flexible resource allocation began immediately, implemented with the same systematic precision that had characterized the original assessment deployment. Priority classifications were dissolved, defensive assignments were redistributed according to immediate tactical requirements, and resource allocation systems were reconfigured to support rapid adaptation to evolving battlefield conditions. The psychological impact on the civilian population was immediate and severe. People who had accepted their assigned roles in the preservation hierarchy suddenly found themselves in completely different circumstances, with no explanation for the changes and no guidance about how to interpret their new situations. The predictability that had allowed many to maintain psychological stability was replaced by uncertainty that bordered on chaos. Some civilians welcomed the changes, particularly those who had been classified as expendable and now found themselves with access to better resources and protection. Others, especially those who had been in high-priority categories, experienced the transition as a betrayal of promises that had never actually been made, but which they had assumed were implicit in their previous treatment. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne watched the dissolution of the assessment protocol with mixed emotions. The systematic approach had been morally troubling in its reduction of human lives to strategic calculations, but it had at least provided a framework for understanding the logic behind individual fates. The new flexible allocation system offered no such clarity, leaving everyone equally uncertain about their prospects for survival. She continued her xenobiology research, but with growing awareness that her work was now just one variable among many in tactical calculations that changed constantly in response to battlefield developments. Her expertise remained valuable, but her preservation was no longer guaranteed by systematic prioritization. She could die at any moment if tactical requirements changed, her death serving whatever purpose the Space Marines deemed most appropriate for current circumstances. The moral weight of her situation had shifted but not diminished. Instead of being complicit in a system that sacrificed others for her benefit, she was now part of a fluid tactical environment where anyone might be sacrificed at any time for reasons that would never be fully explained or understood. The uncertainty was terrifying, but it was also somehow more honest about the true nature of their circumstances. Brother Sergeant Maximus led his tactical squad through the contested middle sectors, implementing the new flexible allocation protocols with the adaptability that was the hallmark of Astartes' effectiveness. The transition required rapid assessment of local conditions and immediate reallocation of personnel and resources according to tactical requirements that changed hourly as battlefield dynamics evolved. The work was more challenging than the systematic implementation of assessment protocol guidelines, requiring constant decision-making and continuous adaptation to circumstances that defied prediction or preparation. But it was also more tactically responsive, allowing defensive strategies to evolve as quickly as Tyranid assault patterns without being constrained by predetermined hierarchies or resource allocation frameworks. Individual civilians became tactical assets to be deployed according to immediate requirements rather than long-term strategic planning. Their skills, capabilities, and survival prospects were evaluated continuously, with assignments and resource allocation adjusted in real time to maximize current tactical effectiveness. The approach was less efficient in terms of resource utilization, but far more adaptable to the kind of rapidly changing battlefield conditions that characterized warfare against hive mind intelligence. The sergeant observed these changes with professional interest, noting how the increased tactical flexibility affected both human performance and Tyranid response patterns. The abandonment of systematic approaches seemed to be degrading enemy pattern analysis capabilities, but it was also reducing the overall coordination and efficiency of human defensive efforts. The trade-off between predictability and effectiveness was playing out in real time, with casualties on both sides serving as measures of tactical success or failure. As the siege entered its fifth day, the true scope of the Space Marines' tactical experiment became apparent to those with sufficient perspective to understand it. The assessment protocol had never been intended as a permanent defensive strategy, but rather as one component in a larger process of tactical adaptation designed to identify optimal approaches for warfare against hive mind intelligence. The billions of people fighting and dying on Tertius Majoris were participants in a vast field experiment, their individual fates determined by the need to test different approaches to resource allocation and tactical decision-making under combat conditions. The assessment protocol had provided data about systematic approaches, while its abandonment would generate information about flexible adaptation strategies. Both approaches would be evaluated, refined, and incorporated into updated tactical doctrines that would be applied on other worlds facing similar threats. The knowledge gained from their sacrifices would benefit future populations, improving the Imperium's ability to resist Tyranid incursions through better understanding of optimal resource allocation strategies under various combat scenarios. The realization was simultaneously horrifying and oddly comforting. Their suffering served a purpose beyond mere survival, contributing to accumulated knowledge that could help preserve human civilization against existential threats. They were not simply victims of alien aggression, but active participants in humanity's ongoing struggle for survival in a hostile galaxy. Captain Vex stood once again on the highest spire of the planetary governor's palace, his enhanced senses monitoring the tactical situation as the siege approached its crucial phase. The flexible allocation strategy was showing promising results, with Tyranid assault effectiveness declining as their pattern analysis capabilities were disrupted by unpredictable human tactical responses. But the cost was becoming unsustainable. Casualty rates had increased significantly as systematic efficiency was sacrificed for tactical adaptability. Resource consumption was exceeding all projections as the abandonment of prioritization systems led to wasteful allocation patterns that could not be maintained indefinitely. The captain faced the possibility that both approaches were fundamentally flawed when applied to defense against hive mind intelligence at this scale. Perhaps the very act of systematic decision-making, whether through rigid protocols or flexible adaptation, created patterns that sufficiently advanced alien intelligence could learn to exploit. Perhaps effective defense required approaches that transcended rational calculation entirely. The thought was disturbing to a mind trained in the supremacy of logical analysis and mathematical precision. But warfare against the Great Devourer had always pushed imperial tactical doctrine to its limits, forcing innovations and adaptations that challenged basic assumptions about military effectiveness. As he contemplated these possibilities, reports began reaching him of a new development in the Tyranid assault pattern. The hive mind appeared to be shifting its strategy, abandoning attempts to exploit human tactical patterns in favor of a more direct approach, focused purely on biomass consumption rather than strategic targeting. The change suggested that the Space Marines' tactical experiments had been successful in disrupting enemy analysis capabilities to the point where the Tyranids were reverting to more primitive assault methodologies. But it also meant that the battlefield was about to become far more violent and chaotic, with Xenos forces focusing on maximum destruction rather than tactical precision. The final phase of the siege was about to begin, and all of the calculations, protocols, and strategic innovations of the past 5 days would be tested in a crucible of violence that would determine whether any portion of Tertius Majoris could be preserved from the Great Devourer's endless hunger. Captain Vex prepared for the ultimate trial of his tactical theories, knowing that the mathematical precision of space marine warfare was about to collide with the raw biological imperative of an alien species evolved for nothing but consumption and growth. The assessment protocol and its abandonment had been preludes to this moment, when all systematic approaches would be measured against the fundamental question of survival in its most basic and unforgiving form. The 17 billion souls of Tertius Majoris waited for the final calculation, the ultimate determination of their worth in the eyes of angels who had reduced their lives to variables in equations that even they might not fully understand.